Let's talk about disciples. If I were to say to you, what is a disciple? What would you say? Think about that. What is a disciple? Well, a disciple is simply a follower of someone's teachings or a follower of someone. John the Baptist had disciples when he was here on earth. And I think most of us, when we think of disciples in a biblical sense, we think of the 12 called people that Jesus called to follow him. The 12 disciples are familiar to us. Some of them are more familiar to us than others because the Bible shares a little bit more information about them. But they were just 12 ordinary men that Jesus called while he was here on earth and told them to follow him. And they did. They stopped what they were doing. They left their family for a short time. They left their jobs. They trusted Jesus. They liked what they saw in him. And they followed him, and they helped him, and they served others. Sometimes I think we think of the disciples as, these supernatural beings, these perfect people. Nope. In fact, as we study the disciples, you're going to see that they were ordinary, just like you, just like me. There was nothing super special about them. In fact, some of the disciples were kind of despised by society. There were some disciples who were involved with different occupations that society looked down on. You may be familiar with the way that tax collectors ran their business. We talked about this already this year, how tax collectors were hated because the Romans would say, all right, tax the people, and you're going to be in charge of that. And so they would put a tax on people, but they didn't just put the Roman tax on. They decided to put a little extra in for themselves. And so they were known as cheats. And the Jewish people didn't like them. In fact, they despised them. Then there were people who thought that they were going to go around and, take care of things and matters the way that they think that the way that they thought they should. They weren't necessarily relying on the government to do things. They didn't like the Roman government. They thought that things should be handled a certain way. And so they were called zealots. And we did talk about that a little bit already. And so Jesus actually had a zealot on his crew of disciples. He had a tax collector on his crew of disciples. He had ordinary fishermen who were poor people, generally speaking, back in that time period. And so there were a lot of people that we wouldn't look at the person and say, you're a good candidate for a disciple. No, Jesus uses ordinary people. And I just love that Jesus does that because it makes me realize that, I strive to do what God wants me to do, and I want to be the way that he tells us to be in his Bible, but I'm not perfect, and I'm certainly not special in terms of society, but in God's eyes, I am, and you are too. You are very special, and you might think, well, I don't come from a very wealthy family, or I don't have any special talent, or I'm not a very good musician. Hello, have you heard me sing? Have you seen me draw? Right? We all have things that God has given to us that make us special in his eyes, but not necessarily the way that we view ourselves. And so God uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things. And just like God used ordinary guys back in Bible times to be his disciples, guess what? He's going to use you too if you're willing. So a disciple is simply a follower of someone who is following the teachings, in this case, the teachings of Jesus. So we're going to be starting a unit where we're going to get to know the disciples a little bit better. So this week, we're going to be focused on just getting to know them generally, who they are. I'm sending home this packet in your packet pickup, and it has a little song, words to it, and you're going to see that video this week. I'm also sending home this, which has a list of the disciples so that you can get familiar with them. Sometimes in the Bible, a couple of the disciples are mentioned with different names, and so we'll talk a little bit about that and so forth. So check out Google Classroom for your assignments this week, but just know that we're going to get to know the disciples a bit this week. Next week, you're going to start a disciples project. Happy discipling!